Thomas Reed never planned to buy anything that day, but the thrift store on the edge of Kirksville, Missouri seemed to call him through the biting Midwest wind, its dusty windows rattling like they were begging him to step inside. He'd stormed out of his apartment after another fight with his girlfriend, Sarah, her words, "You're aimless, Tom, just drifting," still stinging in his ears as he pushed through the creaking door, the bell above jangling like a warning he didn't heed. The place smelled like mothballs and mildew, a squat brick building where forgotten things gathered dust. And Thomas, a lanky 28-year-old with chewed-up nails and a restless streak, wandered the aisles aimlessly until he saw it. A faded brown corduroy jacket slung over a rusted hanger in the back corner, glowing faintly under the flickering fluorescent lights. It wasn't tagged, no price, no size, just hanging there, soft and worn, like it had been waiting for him all along. He ran his fingers over the fabric, surprised by how warm it felt, despite the chill seeping through the cracked walls, the cuffs frayed and the elbows patched with mismatched thread that looked hastily sewn. It fit him perfectly when he slipped it on, hugging his shoulders like it was made for him, and he didn't even bother haggling with the cashier. A gaunt woman with eyes like clouded marbles who barely glanced up from her crossword puzzle as she muttered, $10. Thomas paid and left, the jacket clinging to him as he stepped into the gray afternoon, a shiver racing up his spine, not from the cold, but from something electric, like static threading through his bones. Back at his cramped apartment above, the laundromat, he sprawled on the sagging couch, still wearing it, flipping through TV channels while the hum of dryers below pulsed like a heartbeat he couldn't shake. Sleep came fast that night, but it wasn't peaceful. Dreams clawed at him, vivid and suffocating, dragging him down a dirt road under a moonless sky, his bare feet pounding the earth as a low, guttural voice hissed his name. Thomas. Thomas. Wear me. He jolted awake, sweat soaking his shirt, the jacket still on, its weight heavier than it should have been. The clock blinked 3:14 a.m., and the room was too quiet. No dryer hum, no distant cars, just a faint rustle, like fabric shifting on its own. He yanked the jacket off, tossing it onto a chair, and stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on his face as his reflection stared back, haggard, bloodshot, with dark circles carving hollows under his eyes. For a moment he swore he saw something in the mirror, a shadow behind him, tall and thin, its arms too long, but when he spun around, there was nothing, just the jacket, slumped over the chair like it was watching him. By noon, Thomas was a wreck, pacing his apartment with a jittery edge, the rustling sound looping in his mind like a broken record he couldn't unplug. Sarah texted an apology, asking him to meet her at the diner on Main Street, and he grabbed the jacket without thinking. It was cold out after all, and headed into the gray, empty streets of Kirksville, the wind carrying a faint whine he couldn't place. At the diner, Sarah noticed it first, sipping her coffee and tilting her head. New jacket, kinda retro. He shrugged, forcing a grin. Thrift store find, grows on you. She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes, and when she asked if he was okay, he brushed it off, blaming a rough night, until the rustling started again, soft at first, then insistent, like fingernails. Scraping corduroy, coming from the jacket draped over the booth. Sarah didn't hear it, chattering on about her job while Thomas gripped the table, his knuckles white, the sound burrowing into his skull. Sharper now, whispering things he didn't want to understand. Wear me and keep me in your mind. He cut her off mid-sentence and snapping, "You hear that?" But she just frowned, confused, and he couldn't explain. The rustling was inside him now, threading through his thoughts, drowning her out. He bolted up, muttering some excuse about needing air, and stumbled outside, the cold biting his skin. As he clutched the jacket, its fabric pulsing faintly, too warm like it was alive. Back home, he threw it into the closet and slammed the door, his hands shaking as he dialed James, his mechanic buddy with a no-nonsense streak, begging him to come over and make sense of it. James showed up an hour later, cracking a beer and smirking at the closet like it was a punchline. "You're losing it over a jacket, man? What's next, haunted underwear?" But when Thomas dragged it out, the corduroy catching the light, in a way that made it look slick, almost wet. James touched it and flinched, his grin fading. Damn, that's weird. Feels alive. They decided to burn it, hauling it to the backyard and dousing it with lighter fluid, the flames hissing as they licked up the sleeves, spitting black smoke that reeked of rot and copper. Thomas watched it curl and char, the tension in his chest, easing as the fire devoured it, and that night he slept without dreams, the rustling finally gone, or so he thought. At dawn, he woke to a weight on his chest, heavy and suffocating, and his eyes snapped open to see the jacket, charred, reeking of ash, draped over him like a shroud, its sleeves coiling around his arms as he thrashed. He screamed, or tried to, but the sound lodged in his throat as the fabric tightened, threads burrowing into his wrists, his neck, his chest, red welts blooming where they pierced, stitching him into it. The voice was louder now, inside his skull. You can't leave. Me, I chose you. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Sarah probably, but he couldn't reach it, the jacket dragging him down into the mattress, its weight crushing his ribs as his vision blurred, the room tilting into darkness. In the corner, he saw it. Oh, figure tall and thin, its body woven from corduroy, its face a blank expanse of fabric, motionless but alive, watching as the jacket did its work. Hours later, Sarah pounded on his apartment door, her calls unanswered, and when she let herself in with the spare key, the place was empty. No Thomas, no sign of a struggle, just a faint scorch mark on the bed and a lingering smell of burnt cloth. The closet door hung open, a single hanger swaying gently, and though she searched, she never found the jacket, or him. Weeks later, in a thrift store in Hannibal, Missouri, a woman browsing the racks paused, her fingers brushing a faded corduroy jacket unmarked and whispering her name, its fabric soft and warm, waiting for its next wearer. Eleanor Hayes had always been a scavenger, the kind of person who could spot a diamond in a pile of junk, and that's why she loved the sprawling thrift store just outside Mobile, Alabama, a cavernous warehouse where the air hung thick with dust and the faint tang of old sweat. It was a humid Saturday in late September, the kind where the heat clung to your skin like a second layer, and Eleanor, a wiry 34-year-old with sharp green eyes and a habit of humming under her breath, was elbow-deep in a bin of unsorted clothes when she found it. A pale blue sundress with tiny embroidered roses along the hem, delicate and faded, like something a grandmother might have worn to church decades ago. She held it up to the dim light, the fabric cool against her fingers despite the stifling heat, and for a moment she swore she heard a sigh, a soft, breathy sound that wasn't hers. The dress was a steal at $3, and the cashier, a bored teenager with chipped nail polish, didn't even look at it as she rang it up. Her eyes glued to her phone while Eleanor stuffed it into her tote bag and headed home to her shotgun, house on the edge of town. She hung it in her bedroom that night, the dress swaying gently on its hanger as the ceiling fan whirred overhead, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, those little roses glinting like eyes, in the moonlight spilling through the blinds. Sleep came uneasy, her dreams tangled with images of a field under a bruised sky, tall grass bending in the wind, and a figure in a blue dress standing motionless at the edge, her face hidden, her hands dripping with something dark and wet. Morning brought a headache and a strange itch along her arms, faint red lines like scratches she couldn't remember getting. And when Eleanor stumbled to the bathroom, she caught a whiff of something sour, like damp earth and decay, clinging to the air. She chalked it up to the old house, its pipes groaning and its floors creaking. But as she brewed coffee, she noticed the dress wasn't in the bedroom anymore. It was draped over the kitchen chair, the hem brushing the linoleum like it had walked there on its own. Her stomach twisted, but she laughed it off, blaming a late-night haze, and slipped it back onto the hanger, her fingers lingering on the fabric, which felt heavier now, damp in a way that made her skin crawl. By afternoon, Eleanor couldn't ignore it. The itch was worse, the red lines on her arms darkening into welts, and that sour smell followed her everywhere, seeping from the dress even when she stuffed it into a garbage bag and tossed it in the backyard shed. She called her sister Maggie, who lived an hour away in Pensacola, her voice shaky as she described the dress and the dreams, the way the roses seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Maggie, practical and blunt, told her to burn it, and Eleanor agreed, dragging the bag out under the setting sun. The sky streaked with orange and purple as she doused the dress with gasoline from the lawnmower can. The flames caught fast, licking up the blue fabric, and for a moment she thought she heard a scream, high and thin, before the fire swallowed it, leaving a pile of ash that smelled like burnt flowers and blood. Relief washed over her that night, the welts fading, the air clearing, and Eleanor slept dreamlessly for the first time in days, the shed locked tight and the windows shut against the Alabama heat. But at dawn she woke to a chill, her breath fogging in the air, and there it was. The dress, pristine and unburned, hanging in her closet, the roses along the hem darker now, almost black, their threads glistening like they were wet. She stumbled back, her heart hammering, and when she reached for her phone to call Maggie, her fingers brushed the fabric, cold, clammy, sticking to her skin like it didn't want to let go. The welts flared again, sharper this time, snaking up her arms and across her chest, and she felt it. A pull, like the dress was tugging her toward something she couldn't see. She fought it all day, locking the closet and piling furniture against the door. But the house grew colder, the lights flickering, and that sigh. She heard it again, louder now, echoing from the walls, the floor, her own throat. By nightfall, Eleanor was frantic, her skin burning where the welts twisted into patterns. Roses, she realized, staring in the bathroom mirror as the red lines bloomed across her collarbone, matching the dress stitch for stitch. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, determined to cut it apart, and stormed to the closet, yanking the door open only to find it empty, the hanger bare, swaying slightly. A creak behind her made her spin, and there it was. The dress, standing, upright in the hallway, its sleeves limp but its bodice rigid like something was inside it holding it up. Eleanor lunged, slashing at it, the knife tearing through fabric that bled, dark, thick liquid pooling on the floor, soaking her bare feet as the dress crumpled, only to rise again, the roses wriggling like worms against the blue. She screamed, swinging wildly, but it moved faster, the hem wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down as the sleeves coiled up her arms, pinning her to the ground. The fabric pressed against her face, cold and wet, smothering her as that sigh became a voice, soft, pleading, "Wear me, stay with me." Her vision darkened, the welts pulsing in time with her heartbeat, and she saw the field again, the figure in the dress turning to face her, its eyes hollow, its hands dripping, reaching out as the roses stitched themselves into her skin. Maggie arrived the next morning, worried after Eleanor's garbled voicemail, and found the house silent, the air heavy with that sour decay. The closet was empty, the knife abandoned on the floor, its blade stained with something dark, and Eleanor was gone. No note, no trace, just a faint outline of ash in the backyard where the dress had burned. Weeks later, a thrift store in Biloxi, Mississippi got a new donation. A pale blue sundress with embroidered roses, pristine and delicate, hanging quietly in the women's section, waiting for someone new to claim it. James Carter didn't believe in luck, good or bad, but when he stumbled into the thrift store in Boise, Idaho on a frigid November afternoon, he couldn't resist the pull of a black wool coat tucked between moth-eaten sweaters and stained flannels, its collar crisp and its buttons gleaming like polished onyx. The air in the shop was stale, heavy with the scent of old leather and forgotten lives, and James, a broad-shouldered 42-year-old with a graying beard and a mechanic's rough hands, figured it was just the kind of find to keep him warm through the brutal Idaho winter creeping in. He tried it on right there, the coat settling over his frame like it belonged, and when he asked the price, the old man behind the counter, a wiry figure with a face like crumpled paper, grunted, "$5, take it," without meeting his eyes. James wore it home, the wind howling down the empty streets as snow flurried around him, and the coat felt good. Too good, maybe. Its weight solid but comforting, like an arm slung over his shoulders. He hung it by the door of his small ranch house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a mile off, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. And that night, as he sank into his recliner with a beer, he noticed a faint sound, a low, steady creak like leather stretching coming from the coat. He brushed it off as the house settling, the wind rattling the windows, but sleep brought something worse. Dreams of a snow-covered forest, branches snapping, underfoot and a figure in a black coat stalking just out of sight, its breath fogging the air in sharp, angry bursts. He woke with a start, his chest tight, the room colder than it should have been, and when he flicked on the lamp, the coat wasn't by the door. It was draped over the couch, inches from his feet, its buttons catching the light like tiny, unblinking eyes. James cursed, blaming a half-remembered stumble in the dark, and hauled it back to the hook, his fingers brushing the wool and finding it damp, almost slick, though the floor was dry. Morning came gray and bleak, the snow piling up outside, and he wore the coat to work at the auto shop, ignoring the way it seemed to cling tighter as the day wore on, the creaking louder now, threading through the clang of tools and the hum of engines until his coworker Pete asked why he kept muttering under his breath, except James hadn't said a word. By evening, the creaking was constant, a rhythm in his skull he couldn't shake, and when he peeled the coat off in the shop's break room, he saw it, faint scratches on his arms, red and raw, like something had clawed him through his shirt. Pete laughed it off, saying he'd probably brushed against a rusted fender, but James wasn't so sure. And that night, alone in his house, he locked the coat in the hall closet, wedging a chair under the knob for good measure. Sleep eluded him, the creaking replaced by a new sound, scratching, faint at first, then sharper like nails digging into wood coming from the closet. He grabbed his shotgun from the bedroom, heart pounding, and yanked the door open, but the coat was still there, hanging limp, though the inside of the door was scored with deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. He called his sister Laura, who lived in Twin Falls, her voice crackling over the line as he told her about the coat, the dreams, the scratches spreading up his arms like veins. She told him to get rid of it, burn it if he had to, and James agreed, dragging it out to the fire pit behind the house as dusk settled over the snow-dusted yard. He doused it with kerosene, the flames roaring up fast, and for a moment he thought he saw the coat twist in the fire, the wool writhing like it was alive before it collapsed into ash, the air thick with a bitter metallic stench. He slept better, that night, the scratches fading, the house quiet, and he figured it was over, until dawn broke and he found the coat back on its hook by the door, pristine, untouched by flame, its buttons glinting mockingly in the pale light. James didn't wait for answers. He grabbed it and drove, the snow crunching under his truck's tires as he headed for the thrift store, determined to dump it where he'd found it. The old man was there, hunched over the counter, and when James threw the coat down and demanded to know where it came from, the man just shrugged, his voice a rasp. People drop things off, don't ask, don't care. James stormed out, leaving it behind, but that night the scratching started again. Not from the closet, but from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, louder and faster, like it was clawing its way back. He found it at midnight, spread across his bed, the wool damp and cold, the scratches on his arms bleeding now, carving jagged lines that mirrored the marks on the closet door. He tried burning it again, this time in the bathtub, watching the flames until nothing but soggy ash remained. But by morning it was back, hanging in the kitchen, dripping wet, the buttons clicking against each other like teeth. The dreams came harder that night, the figure in the coat closer now, its face shadowed but its hands visible, pale, scarred, reaching for him as the forest closed in. James woke, gasping, the coat on him, its sleeves wrapped tight around his chest, the wool pressing into his skin like it was trying to sink inside. He clawed at it, tearing it off, but the scratches were everywhere now. His arms, his legs, his face, deep and red, pulsing as the creaking filled his ears, drowning out his screams. Laura showed up 2 days later, worried after his phone went straight to voicemail, and found the house empty, the front door swinging in the wind, snow drifting across the floor. The coat was gone, and so was James. No blood, no note, just the fire pit full of cold ash and a faint trail of scratches etched into the porch, leading nowhere. A week later, in a thrift store in Pocatello, Idaho, a man browsing the racks paused, his hand brushing a black wool coat with gleaming buttons. Its wool soft and inviting, whispering faintly in the quiet. Clara Thompson never could resist a bargain. So when she spotted the thrift store in Asheville, North Carolina, tucked between a pawn shop and a diner on a rainy October evening, she ducked inside, shaking water from her umbrella as the door groaned shut behind her. The place was a maze of cluttered racks and sagging shelves, the air thick with the musty scent of damp fabric and old wood. And Clara, a 29-year-old artist with a knack for finding beauty in the discarded, wandered the aisles until her fingers brushed a pair of leather gloves, soft chestnut brown with faint stitching along the seams, sitting alone on a chipped display case. They were unmarked, no price tag, just waiting there, and when she slipped them on, they fit like a second skin, warm and snug despite the chill seeping through the walls. She haggled the cashier down to $2, a tired woman with a smoker's rasp who didn't seem to care, and left with the gloves tucked into her coat pocket, the rain drumming against her hood as she hurried back to her loft downtown. That night she left them on her cluttered workbench, surrounded by half-finished canvases and paint-stained rags, and as she drifted to sleep, the patter of rain outside morphed into something else, faint tapping like fingertips on glass, sharp and insistent, pulling her into dreams of a dark street, wet cobblestones gleaming under gaslights and hands in leather gloves reaching out from the shadows, grasping at nothing. She woke with a jolt, her pulse racing, and found the gloves on her nightstand, not the workbench. Their fingers curled slightly as if they'd moved on their own. Morning brought unease, the tapping lingering in her ears like an echo she couldn't shake. And when Clara reached for her coffee mug, she noticed her hands. Red marks on her knuckles, faint but raw, like she'd been gripping something too tight. She brushed it off as a painter's hazard, her mind on the gloves as she slipped them on again, heading out to meet her friend Daniel at a cafe on Biltmore Avenue. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gray, and as she walked, the gloves felt heavier, the leather creaking softly with every step, a sound that gnawed at her nerves until Daniel asked why she kept flexing her hands. She hadn't even noticed she was doing it. By afternoon, the marks on her knuckles were darker, spreading like ink across her fingers, and the tapping was louder now, not just in her head but in the walls of her loft, sharp and rhythmic, like someone knocking to be let in. She yanked the gloves off, tossing them into a drawer, but the creaking didn't stop. It followed her, threading through the hum of the radiator, the clink of her paintbrushes, until she couldn't tell if it was the gloves or her own bones protesting. That night she locked the drawer and shoved her dresser against it, but sleep brought the dream again. Those gloved hands closer now, wrapping around her wrists, pulling her down a street that stretched into darkness, the tapping pounding in her skull like a heartbeat she couldn't escape. She called Daniel the next day, her voice trembling as she told him about the gloves, the marks, the way they'd been on her workbench again that morning despite the locked drawer. He showed up an hour later, skeptical but worried, and when he held the gloves, he frowned, rubbing the leather between his fingers. It was damp, he said, like they'd been out in the rain, though they'd been inside all night. They decided to destroy them, driving out to a wooded spot off the Blue Ridge Parkway, where Clara doused the gloves with lighter fluid and watched them burn, the flames hissing as the leather curled and blackened, releasing a sharp, acrid smell that stung her eyes. She felt lighter on the drive back, the tapping gone, the marks fading, and she slept soundly that night, the loft quiet for the first time in days. But at dawn, she woke to a weight on her chest, her breath catching as she saw the gloves, unburned, pristine, resting on her stomach, the leather cool and slick against her skin. She screamed, flinging them across the room, but they landed upright. Fingers splayed like they were reaching for her, and the tapping started again, louder, faster, shaking the walls as the marks on her hands flared, red and jagged, snaking up her arms. She grabbed a hammer from her toolbox, smashing at them, the leather splitting only to stitch itself back together, the seams tightening as the gloves twitched, inching toward her across the floor. She bolted for the door, but the gloves were faster, the fingers wrapping around her ankles, dragging her back as the leather pressed into her flesh, cold and unyielding. Clara fought, clawing at the floor. But the gloves climbed higher, one slipping over her hand, forcing her fingers inside, the other coiling around her throat, squeezing until her vision blurred. The tapping was deafening now, a chorus of unseen. Hands pounding from every corner, and she saw them, the figures from her dreams lining the room, their gloved hands outstretched, their faces blank as the leather tightened, merging with her skin. Daniel found the loft empty the next day, the door ajar, paint cans spilled across the floor, and no sign of Clara. Just a faint trail of red marks on the workbench, like fingerprints burned into the wood. A week later, in a thrift store in Greenville, South Carolina, a pair of chestnut-brown leather gloves sat on a display case, soft and inviting, waiting for a new pair of hands to claim them. Margaret Evans wasn't looking for anything special when she stepped into the thrift store in Concord, New Hampshire, on a crisp December afternoon, the kind where the air bit at your nose and the sky hung low with the promise of snow. She was, too, a librarian with a quiet life and a love for vintage finds, and the store, a narrow, dimly lit shop squeezed between a hardware store and a vacant lot, felt like a treasure trove, its racks overflowing with faded fabrics and forgotten stories. Her eyes landed on a silk scarf, deep crimson with a subtle paisley pattern, draped over a mannequin's shoulder like a ribbon of blood against the gray plaster. And when she touched it, the fabric was cool and smooth, sliding through her fingers, like water. It was $2 a steal, and the cashier, a young man with a distracted stare, barely glanced at it as he stuffed it into a paper bag. She wore it home, tying it loosely around her neck as she walked through the snow-dusted streets, the scarf fluttering in the wind like it was alive. And by the time she reached her small colonial house on the edge of town, the crimson seemed brighter, richer, against the pale wool of her coat. That night she left it on the kitchen table, planning to wash it in the morning. But as she climbed into bed, a faint hum drifted through the house, low and melodic, like a voice singing just out of reach, pulling her into dreams of a grand ballroom, chandeliers dripping light and a figure in a crimson scarf spinning endlessly, its face blurred, its hands stained dark. She woke breathless, her throat dry, and found the scarf on her pillow, not the table, its silk cool against her cheek despite the warmth of the room. Morning came with a strange heaviness, her fingers tingling as she brewed tea, and when she glanced in the mirror, she saw faint red lines around her neck, thin like threads, barely visible, but tender to the touch. She blamed the scarf, figuring it was too tight when she'd worn it, but as she reached for it, now back on the kitchen table, the hum started again, louder, threading through the clink of her teacup until her head throbbed with it. She decided to wear it to work at the library, brushing off the unease, and as she shelved books, her coworker Ruth asked why she kept humming. She hadn't realized she was, but the sound wasn't hers. It was the scarf's, vibrating against her skin like a living thing. By afternoon, the lines on her neck were darker, curling like vines, and the hum was constant, a melody she couldn't place but couldn't escape, burrowing into her thoughts until she snapped at a patron for no reason, her hands shaking as she shoved the scarf into her bag. That night she locked it in a drawer in her study, the hum muffled but still there, and sleep brought the ballroom again. Closer now, the figure's hands reaching for her, the silk of the scarf tightening around her throat as the room spun. She woke gasping, clawing at her neck, and the scarf was there, out of the drawer, wrapped around her like a noose, the crimson glowing faintly in the dark. She tore it off, her skin burning where it had touched, and the lines were thicker now, red and raised, pulsing faintly as the hum turned into a whisper. "Wear me. Dance with me." She called Ruth the next day, her voice hoarse as she explained the scarf, the dreams, the marks creeping up her jaw. And Ruth, practical, no-nonsense Ruth, told her to burn it, to get it out of the house. Margaret agreed, bundling it into a metal trash can in her backyard as snow flurried around her, the flames catching fast when she lit it, the silk curling and blackening as the hum became a shriek, high and piercing, before fading into silence. She slept that night, The marks fading, the air still, and thought it was over until dawn broke and she felt it. The silk, cool and smooth, draped across her chest, unburned, the crimson deeper now, the paisley pattern shifting like eyes watching her from the fabric. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed scissors, hacking at it, but the silk wouldn't tear. The blade sliding off as the scarf slithered out of her grip, coiling around her wrists, pulling her hands together like shackles. The hum was deafening, a chorus of whispers now, and the marks on her neck flared, spreading across her chest, her arms tracing the paisley and red welts that burned. She stumbled to the fireplace, shoving it into the embers, watching it writhe as the flames licked up, but it crawled out unscathed, wrapping around her legs, dragging her down as the ballroom filled her vision. The figure close now, its face, a void, its stained hands forcing the scarf around her throat tighter. Ruth found the house empty 2 days later, the front door locked, the fireplace cold, and no sign of Margaret. Just a faint hum lingering in the air, and a single red thread caught in the snow outside. A week later, in a thrift store in Manchester, New Hampshire, a crimson silk scarf hung on a rack, its paisley pattern subtle and inviting, waiting for someone new to tie it around their neck. Henry Sullivan wasn't the type to linger in thrift stores, but on a rainy April evening in Savannah, Georgia, the neon sign of a shop on Bull Street flickered just as he passed, drawing him inside with the promise of shelter and maybe a cheap distraction from the monotony of his 35-year-old life as a delivery driver. The place was a humid tangle of overstuffed racks and chipped furniture, the air thick with the scent of mildew and sweet tea gone sour. And Henry, broad and restless with a habit of cracking his knuckles, spotted it almost immediately. A gray fedora, weathered but sharp, perched on a mannequin's head like it was waiting for him to claim it. He brushed the brim, the felt soft and cool despite the sticky heat, and when he tried it on, it fit perfectly, tilting just right over his brow as if it belonged there. The cashier, a wiry old woman with a lazy eye, muttered, $4, without looking up from her tabloid, and Henry paid, wearing the fedora out into the drizzle, the rain beating on the felt but never soaking through. Back at his shotgun house near the river, he tossed it onto the arm of his threadbare couch, the brim casting a shadow that stretched too long across the room. And that night, as he dozed off to the hum of cicadas outside, a faint whistle cut through the dark, sharp, tuneless like wind through a cracked window, pulling him into dreams of a foggy alley, gaslights flickering, and a figure in a gray fedora tipping its hat, its face shadowed, but its grin wide and wet. He woke sweating, the whistle still ringing in his ears, and found the fedora on his chest, not the couch, its brim pressed against his skin like it had crawled there. Morning brought a dull ache behind his eyes, the whistle lingering like a memory he couldn't place, and when he shaved, he noticed faint gray marks on his temples, smudges like ash that wouldn't wash off. He wore the fedora to work anyway, blaming the rain for his mood, and as he drove his delivery route through Savannah's moss-draped streets, the whistle grew louder, threading through the rumble of the truck's engine until his co-worker, Nate, asked why he kept whistling. He hadn't been, but the sound was there, sharp and insistent, coming from the hat. By noon, the marks on his temples were darker, spreading like cracks across his forehead, and the fedora felt heavier, tugging at his scalp as if it wanted to sink in. That evening, Henry yanked it off, tossing it into a closet and slamming the "Topher." But the whistling didn't stop. It echoed from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, a tuneless wail that clawed at his nerves until he couldn't sleep. The dreams came harder that night, the figure in the alley closer, its grin splitting, wider, teeth glinting as it tipped the fedora, and Henry woke clawing at his face, the gray marks burning, tracing lines down his cheeks like veins. He called Nate, his voice ragged as he described the hat, the whistle, the way it was back on the couch when he'd checked the closet, empty. And Nate, half asleep but loyal, told him to ditch it, burn it, anything to make it stop. Henry dragged it to the backyard at dawn, the sky bruised with clouds, and doused it with gasoline, the flames roaring as the fedora blackened and curled, the whistle rising into a scream, shrill, human, before fading into silence. He stood there panting as the fire died, the ash wet and clumped in the Georgia mud. And that day the marks faded, the whistling gone, his head clear for the first time in days. But at midnight, he woke to a weight on his head. The fedora, back unburned, pristine, its brim shadowing his eyes, the felt cool and damp against his skin. He tore it off, staggering to the mirror, and saw the marks. Darker now, gray and jagged, carving a pattern across his face like the shadow of a brim. And the whistle was inside him, vibrating in his skull. He tried smashing it with a hammer, the felt splitting only to knit itself back together. The brim twitching as it rolled across the floor, inching toward him. He drove it to the river, hurling it into the current, watching it sink beneath the murky water. But by morning, it was on his porch, dripping wet, the whistle louder, angrier, rattling the windows as the marks spread down his neck. The dreams swallowed him that night, the figure in the alley right beside him, its grin a slash of teeth, its hands, gray, scarred, pressing the fedora onto his head, the felt merging with his scalp as the whistle drowned his screams. Nate pounded on his door the next day, worried after a garbled call, and found the house empty. No Henry, no fedora, just a faint gray smudge on the couch and a wet trail leading to the river, vanishing at the edge. 2 weeks later, in a thrift store in Charleston, South Carolina, a gray fedora sat on a rack, its brim sharp and inviting, whistling faintly in the quiet, waiting for someone new to tip it onto their head. That's all 6 tales of terror, woven from the cursed threads of thrift store racks across America. But beware, these stories carry a curse of their own, one that might already be creeping into your closet, waiting for you to slip it on. 2. Fend it off. Subscribe to Mysteries Beyond Death right now. Hit that button, smash the like, and activate notifications so you never miss a nightmare. Drop a comment below. Which piece of clothing would you burn first? Don't wait. The curse is watching.